Hello, and welcome to the Conversations in Time podcasts from the ORC. In this podcast, the guys will be talking about historical what-ifs, or counterfactual history for the aficionados in the audience.
Hello, and welcome to another episode from the ORC, Conversations in Time. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
Right, so to start with, just out of interest, Ian, I know you didn't know my granddad, but you know he had the eyes of an eagle and the heart of a lion. He also had a lifetime ban from the zoo, but let's move on. Anyway, right.
I think just boom, boom, isn't it?
Boom, boom. I thought, why not start with a joke?
Indeed. Was it Dudley Zoo by any chance? But anyway, never mind. Twycross.
Twycross, yeah. Who knows? Just thought it's just a joke that tickles. But anyway. Okay, right. So what are we talking about today?
Well, going back quite a long way, and then coming back again, going back 12,000 years ago or so, about the land bridge that existed between Northern Asia, modern-day Russia, and North America, modern-day Alaska. What if it wasn't there? It was used by people who lived in the Central Asian mass to migrate.
In fact, there's an alternative way of looking at it rather than the land bridge not being there. Now I've looked into it. So, but first off, do you want to mention anything about our current analytics? Exciting news.
Yeah, so we've picked up a few listeners. Well, at the moment, one to be precise, but anyway, in Victoria, the state of Victoria in Australia. So welcome aboard. Good day, etc. And other cliches are available. But welcome to our Australian listener. My part of my family live in Australia, so not unfamiliar with it. A great country. So thanks for joining and listening in.
Okay, thanks. I thought I'd let you get the good day in anyway. So, since I did bonjour last week. So. Right. So the land bridge. Just ultimately we're talking about what happens after this, but the land bridge itself, did exist. There's no doubt about that. And the key thing that we're potentially saying would have happened was that the land bridge appeared during an ice age in terms of it was the Pleistocene. I think that's how you pronounce it, Pleistocene. I'm just looking at something online. The Pleistocene era, I think, for the
different, of course, the current epoch, which is plastic scene.
That's right, yeah. So ultimately there was an ice sheet. It was called the Laurentide ice sheet, which spread across most of Canada and the Arctic. Now, what appears, looking at, although there's a lot of conjecture about how it would have worked and whatever, but it appears that there was an ice-free channel through this ice sheet, and that's ultimately where, and this was 20,000 years ago or something like that, around about the 20,000 year period, when people could move between, as you say, the eastern part of the Asian continent through into the western part of the North American continent. And our argument is maybe that ice sheet didn't have an ice-free corridor, and people couldn't actually traverse into North America, and so retreated back into the Asian mainland. The ice melted, the sea came up, and lo and behold, we have arguably a isolated, very much like Australia, but much larger landmass, isolated from human habitation. And we're going to talk about, well, what do we think the impact of that has had moving forward? So for me, interrupt if you want to, don't worry.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, we're also aware that the area of sea between Russia and modern day America isn't huge, so we'll presume that the people had withdrawn significantly back into Asian landmass and didn't just then think, let's just sail across there. So we're presuming that it was a cumulative event that also prevented there wasn't anybody living in that part of Russia essentially as well until we decide there are. So essentially, people didn't cross to North America, is what we're basically saying.
That's right. Yeah. Ultimately, that's I know we're trying to come up with a reason for why they didn't do it, but ultimately, the what if is, well, what happens if they just didn't turn up? Right. So for me, there's probably four key things. So the first one, obviously, is that you have an isolated landmass. All right, only 20,000 years ago. So from an evolutionary perspective, you wouldn't have the same level of unique species as you get, say, in Australia, which has been isolated from other land masses for a significantly longer period. But ultimately, there was a lot of fauna, animal species in North America, which ultimately aren't there anymore thanks to human intervention.
Yeah.
I.e., they were hunted, or the prey that they lived on was hunted, so that they died out. So we'd have a significant landmass with a very, very large, diverse flora and fauna, much more than it is today. Now, so that's a backdrop, I think, in terms of we'd have this massive area of land that's untamed, would be totally wild. But then you've got the three periods for me. So the first one would obviously be Christopher Columbus, 1492, and what the impact of not meeting anybody on his voyage. There's also the 1500, the voyage of Pedro Cabral, who discovered Brazil for the Portuguese in 1500, and then arguably and I don't know who the first settlers into actual North America. People talk about the Founding Fathers, but we could talk about the Founding Fathers as a key event into North America, which would have been significantly impacted without any indigenous population there. So
not they'd all starve to death, you mean?
Well, that's right. So we can start off with Christopher Columbus.
But there's a little bit of fly in the ointment before somebody's out. Hopefully, with enough listeners out there, somebody's shouting, "What about the Polynesians?" But are we going to ignore the Polynesians for a bit, or
what about the Polynesians?
Well, the Polynesians got as far as Easter Island, which is reasonably close to South America. They obviously discovered New Zealand, which is nowhere near America. But
the issue. I'm not saying they didn't do that. The issue is, when did they do it?
Well, New Zealand was about 1,000 years ago, so in the great scheme of things, in historical terms, like yesterday sort of thing. But I couldn't tell about Easter Island. I mean, obviously.
Yeah, but don't forget. So all I'm trying to say is that say they did it 1,000 years ago. Well, Columbus discovered or landed in the West Indies 400 years after that. Yeah. You're not going to populate an entire continent in 400 years.
Yes, you're not going to go from northern Canada to the tip of Cape Horn.
Well, or even being that side of the Andes and then populating the whole of South America.
You're right. Okay, so let's presume the Polynesians may have been there, but we're talking about little pockets here and there sort of thing, because
That's right. I mean, there was I don't know what the estimate in terms of population within North and South America was, but it was certainly hundreds of thousands, if not a million or whatever. That's still a lot.
I think it would be in the millions, to be fair. I mean, if you consider
across the two continents,
the Incas and the Aztecs, which wouldn't have had, but they did have civilizations of complex cities and towns and civilizations with a small c. Yeah, so then there was millions of them.
So we go back to Christopher Columbus.
Mm-hmm.
So he arrives in the West Indies, and obviously he's looking for China or Chipingo, i.e. Japan. But when he gets there, so in the real world, he gets there and he finds the Tainu, or the Tainu, the indigenous population. And what he finds is that they have got some gold ornaments. Now, obviously, he was looking for gold and he found it. Now, yes, he didn't find India, he didn't find China, didn't find Japan. But if he'd have gone there and didn't find anything and just found forested islands with no people, I don't know, what would he have done? He would have gone back to Spain and basically said, there's nothing there. I didn't find China and I found a land with nothing in it.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, the obvious lure of gold is not so much that it's shiny. It's that it's a currency. I don't mean literally a currency. It's a virtual currency. It's easily transportable. It doesn't rot. It doesn't fall to pieces. When you put it in the boat at one end, it comes out the boat at the other end, and you can go and buy a great big estate in Spain or Portugal or Florence or wherever, one of the Italian states, with it. So it's a transportable means of wealth. That's not to say that the other means of wealth cannot be achieved, but you're right. You've got in many cases it's already been dug out the ground. You steal it, you kill the people who own it, and then you put it in your boats and you buy your estate in Spain. You can't do that with a forest. it takes you 50 years to make a forest into a going concern. You either chop it down and grow something else, or you use the wood. And yes, you become very rich, but you can't become very rich in 12 months. So you're right. So that would change the whole dynamic, wouldn't it?
That's right. So I mean, ultimately, and then we're not saying that people wouldn't go back and try doing stuff, because there are other things that the Spanish were doing at the time.
It would be much longer time scale, wouldn't it?
That's right. So, and it's a similar thing for Portugal and Brazil, because obviously we're talking about Brazil as one of the major South American colonizations, although the Spanish obviously did a significant amount as well, because they did the rest of South America outside of Brazil. But so Brazil, it wasn't gold initially that attracted the Portuguese. It was something called Brazil wood, and the discovery that Brazil wood can provide a very vivid red dye for clothing. And that became one of the key drivers for the Portuguese going into Brazil. And of course, this was based on what the indigenous population were doing. So again, that would have been another pushback in terms of the Portuguese would have gone. So Pedro Cabral, he was only there 10 days. He was supposed to be going to India. He would have got there, found a land, lots of forest, no people, would have just would have then carried on to India, and it would have been, okay, there's a land here, but nothing of any significance in terms of benefit to Portugal.
No, you're right. I mean, there's lots of places in the world at that point of history where there's lots of land and lots of trees, isn't there? I mean, and yes, they were all exploited eventually, but it took a long time.
That's right. So if the founding fathers piece is a bit further, it's quite a few hundred years. I don't know how many hundred years. When was the founding fathers? I don't remember the date.
16 something or other, but yeah, it's so
it's 100 and something years later. So as we know, the Spanish were already doing stuff in the Canary Islands in relation to sugarcane. I mean, they're also using slaves to grow and process the sugarcane. And obviously, the Caribbean became a big sugar producing area. Now, that probably wouldn't have changed, but it would have taken a lot longer for somebody to realise, OK, there might not be any gold and there's no people, but it's certainly a land that will grow this valuable crop where we can make a lot of money.
Yeah, because the gold draws people in. If you look at the analogy of the American gold rushes, many people made their money selling people to the gold prospectors. How many gold prospectors actually made their money is, so if you've got a gold rush in the Caribbean, less so particularly in the Caribbean, but it's certainly in the Central American coast of the Caribbean, that draws people in. But that then draws merchants in. Those merchants then stay. Those merchants then develop other aspects of the economy. So I think that's what happened in the Caribbean. But it wouldn't have happened as quickly without the initial draw that drew all the people in looking to steal gold in many cases, and then use slaves to dig it and all the rest of it. If they'd not been there, if there hadn't been processed gold, knowledge of gold, because nobody would have dug it out of the ground because there was nobody to do it, there would be nobody there saying, look at all this gold. There would then be nobody drawn to it. There would be no merchants. There would be no chopping down of trees and replanting with sugarcane at the same rate. So, you could argue it would add, 100 years to that process, 50 years, certainly generations.
Absolutely. No, that's right. Yeah. So then if we turn to North America, so as you said, the founding fathers, would they have starved to death? Because my limited knowledge of what happened in that particular timeline was that without the indigenous population, they would all have starved to death because they didn't know how to live in the environment that they landed in.
Yes, because the summers weren't quite nice, but the winters were dreadful. Absolutely nothing like a European or certainly a British winter. Sub-zero temperatures significantly sub-zero temperatures for weeks on end. There was no maize grown in.
I'm assuming the crops that they took didn't grow.
No.
So that failed.
So it's not so much a question of Indians coming in or Native Americans coming in feeding the inhabitants. There was a little bit of that because they had stores of food, but it was more a question of, this is what we grow, and then we've been here thousands of years, and this is how we grow it. That's not to say that once you'd got to a certain level of subsistence where you weren't dying every hard winter, you couldn't then experiment with crops you were more familiar with. But certainly those initial 5 to 10 years of development of the settlements, they would have. It's difficult to say how they would have survived.
So again, it would have been another timeline where, or time period where instead of it being the 1600s, it could be the 1700s.
Yeah, because
before
people
there's
would still come.
significant.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, I mean, nobody's saying that the discovery of a new land isn't going to excite people, adventurers, to go and figure out what this new land
they'd
can
have
provide.
brought more stores. They'd have brought more ships with stores, and eventually they'd have figured it out, or they'd have built townships which were dependent on trade with the Caribbean and didn't necessarily require them to grow their own food. Certainly they would grow some, so something would have developed in a different way.
That's right. So I suppose the key thing then is, and this is where we're going to be guessing ultimately, is which countries potentially would be rushing to try and find out what this new world had to offer. And I can't see it being any others than the ones that already have a significant footprint in the continents, in the North and South America, i.e. Spain, Portugal, France, Britain. Whether any other European nation may have got on the bandwagon, I mean, I suppose it's feasible.
Well, they had to be a maritime power in the first place. They had to be reasonably wealthy themselves already. So that rules out, frankly, most of the other countries that didn't do it anyway. Italy wasn't really a country as such in those days. It was a conglomeration of states, so it had a seafaring tradition, but it was more inward looking at that point. So yeah, I don't think it would have made a huge difference. The interesting thing.
Sorry.
So I was just going to say whether you've thought about it. Well, it does make you wonder if it would have accelerated the slave trade, because if the Spanish in particular certainly utilized or enslaved the indigenous population in the original scenario until they essentially died out through poor treatment and disease and what have you. And once they'd run through the inhabitants of the original inhabitants, then they started importing slaves. Now, would they have gone straight to that? And what it's interesting is would there be more native, but would there be more people in America now of black origin because there would be more slaves? Possibly not. But it is an interesting thought that there's obviously something to exploit there. We don't want to do it ourselves. They didn't have a huge population to draw back on in Europe that would willingly go to North America at that point. So how would they exploit it?
Well, that's right. So I mean, ultimately, the three key areas are obviously South America with Portugal and the Caribbean, with the French and the British, taking slaves into those islands.
And the Dutch to a certain extent, but yes.
And the Dutch to a certain extent. And then with the expansion of the British in North America, with strangely enough, I've just thought of something else. So one of the things with North America and the slave trade was that it was cotton and tobacco, but it was initially tobacco where the settlers, grew a crop that they could export. But they only found the tobacco weed because the indigenous population were using it.
Yeah.
And there's an argument you could say, well, we wouldn't have cigarettes, or would we have cigarettes? Probably, we might not have cigarettes because, yes, it would be an interesting plant. There's plenty of interesting plants, but it's not necessarily you're going to start chewing it, smoking it.
Well, nobody was doing that with anything else in Europe. And there are probably things that we know there are other things you could smoke, but nobody was doing that. It was very much an item, a product that was discovered in the USA in North America. And if it had not been, as you say, already in use to a certain extent, why would you suddenly, if you have no background whatsoever in smoking some sort of plant or inhaling the smoke of some sort of plant, why would you suddenly walk around a forest floor in North America and think, if I just started smoking that, it would give me some sort of narcotic effect? Well, it wouldn't even cross your mind.
Oh, that's right.
But then it does beg the question is why somebody started doing it in the first place. But that was probably by accident,
But then that could have evolved over thousands. That could be something that took a few thousand years for people to realise. And we're talking about the last 400 years.
Yeah.
So
and even then, based purely on very, very unscientific viewings of cowboy films in my youth, generally the Native American population weren't all sitting around smoking pipes. It was very much a sort of a shaman type thing where the top members of the tribe would do it under ritualistic situations. They weren't all sitting around smoking.
And that they didn't have roll-ups. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
No, well, exactly. So again, it had developed into some sort of ritualized shaman peace pipe. Again, this is all fairly based on very unscientific knowledge, but I think there's probably an element of truth in it. So again, but the Europeans took it and popularized it. Quite why that happened is conjecture, but
so we could say we wouldn't have cigarettes. I think that's a reason. I think
or
that's
tobacco, whatever. But
tobacco, yeah.
But
then there's another plant which, correct me if I'm wrong, that came from North America, or certainly the Americas, which definitely had a significant impact on Europe, and that was the potato.
Yeah, these more South America, but yes.
So if the delay in the delay of the discovery of potatoes and their significant dietary benefit, because the potato had a massive impact on on world population, certainly in Europe.
Yeah,
because it's so high in calories
and relatively easy to grow. I mean, the population explosion in Europe in the late 1700s to well into the late 1800s was purely down to potatoes. Almost without, with the carbohydrate value of potatoes enabled people to have a reasonably easy meal. You can store potatoes quite easily for months on end. They are, or certainly in the early days, are easy to grow. Obviously, as we know, they're prone to blight, and having huge populations dependent on a single crop is pretty disastrous, as many parts of northern Europe discovered in the 1850s, and Western Europe, or the Atlantic-facing parts of Europe certainly. Yeah, but anyway, you're right. It's difficult to see how somebody randomly. I mean, those potatoes that were being eaten later on had been selectively grown for various benefits. So those weren't the potatoes that the people in Southern America were eating, but they had come from those potatoes. So.
Well, they knew they were nutritious. That was the thing.
Yeah, well, indeed, but they were grown to make zillions of types of potatoes, but they were going to be bigger and fluffier and all the rest of it, and more carbohydrate content and all the rest of it, and sugars.
But you could argue that having a horticulturalist going around looking at the flora of the continent, that would have happened, but it isn't necessarily something that would have suddenly exploded in the way.
No, I don't think there's many. I mean, it's interesting because it's kind of the opposite of the tobacco argument, but I can't think of many examples, in fact, any examples of something that's eaten in bulk today that was discovered somewhere, even if there was humans already, that wasn't already being eaten. So nobody said, "Oh, why don't you eat this? It looks delicious." That's never happened. So somebody somewhere, and you say it's not so much a question of just discovering it, I could probably eat that. Ray Mears might come up with that for the benefit of our American and Canadian and Ray Mears is a wilderness expert who pops up on TV. He's on YouTube as well. But that process has to develop. Somebody has to say to you, "We've been eating this. Try this." And if there's nobody there to say these people survive on this product, well, why don't we try it? It's easy to store, it's easy to transport, it's easy to grow, it's easy to propagate, etc. If nobody's doing that for you, that's never going to happen, and/or going to take dozens, if not hundreds of years to become endemic in your society. It's just, it's a very good one. That's a massive impact.
It is, yeah. It only just occurred to me. So if we say that the population explosion, and I don't know, I mean, it changed life expectancy, didn't it? The potato ultimately, because I mean, one of the things you can store it over. Can't you store it over the winter?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to do is keep it dry and dark. You can dig a hole in the ground and put a sack over the top of it. Keeps all the oxygen out. Line the pit. This is what they used to do in certainly in the UK. Well into the 1960s, farmers would, nowadays it's stored in sheds with carbon dioxide and all sorts of stuff. But they would just huge pits, and they would store it in such a way that oxygen couldn't get into the pit, and would survive for months, if not years. Not just to say that it's as good as a fresh potato, but it's still got all the carbohydrates and the sugar, so it's perfectly edible. So you're right. I mean, life expectancy is a slightly different thing, but ultimately, I suppose your children aren't dying of starvation, so that improves life expectancy.
So it was more. So the potato was more to do with starvation rather than healthiness.
Well, no, absolutely. It's all about carbohydrates. It's all about actually not starving. Because the interesting thing, when blight comes along, people starve. Most infamously on Ireland, but obviously in parts of Scotland, the Denmark, Norway,
You're talking about potato blight, though, aren't you?
I am, but that's the point, that you take away you take away that potato and people starve. So if the potato wasn't there in the first place, people would starve, but there wouldn't be millions of people starving because there wouldn't be millions of people in the first place, but people would have starved. I mean, we forget as citizens of the 21st century that until the late 1800s, people would starve in Western Europe. Not massive, not thousands, hundreds of thousands every year, but people would starve. And more to the point, people would leave the land so they didn't starve. People would leave places they'd lived for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, because they were starving. The Western Isles of Scotland, the mountains of Norway. This was happening well into the 1880s, even in the early 20th century. So take away a staple, which our scenario says never existed in the first place, people would still starve, but more at the point, they would starve as children, and they themselves wouldn't live to have offspring, and therefore the population wouldn't rise. It's that sort of.
So that means that if we have a low population in Europe, then the advances that happened in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries, it's arguable. You could argue that would they have happened?
Well, the scientific discoveries might have happened, but there would be nobody to exploit them. So there would be,
but if the population is significantly lower, I mean, I don't know the numbers in terms of the population explosion with the benefits of starch-rich potato, but if we're saying even if it was a third less, would we still have had the same level of stability within European populations? To enable people to sit back and the rich people to think about science and all of that.
I think the rich people always manage to survive, don't they? So
yes.
So the Age of Enlightenment would have happened, but what wouldn't have happened at the same rate would have been the Industrial Revolution. Because although the Industrial Revolution didn't replace jobs, that's our current AI revolution. It created jobs, but it created you. If you were a rich landowner who then converted their land with a mill using these new technologies, the various spinning machines and weaving machines and steam machines that are powering them, that's all good and well, but those mills employed thousands of people. Now, there are still thousands of people to be employed, but there aren't thousands of people to be employed necessarily in every town in our scenario. So every town would have a mill, every town would have a steel mill, every town would have a bleach works, etc., all using technology that had been developed. But if there's nobody to manage each of those spinning machines would have somebody looking after it. Usually a woman, to be fair, but each steel mill would have people looking after it. There's a finite, which is an interesting thought. There's a finite labour resource, which is kind of equivalent to many parts of Western Europe today. And what do we do as a result? Well, we have immigrants. Now, we welcome immigrants to our country. What would we have done in the 1830s with a significantly smaller population? Would we have welcomed immigrants, or guess what we might have done? Look at the Caribbean. Look at southern states of America. Who knows? But that's a whole other area which I'd rather not get into because it's pretty grim. But it's
you'd have to assume that the Industrial Revolution would have been impacted in some way.
Yes.
Even if it would have been delayed by X number of decades, it certainly would have been a much slower burn-in.
Yeah, or we welcome people or steal people to work in areas that we cannot resource ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're concentrating on surviving, and let's face it, if starvation is a realistic option, if the crops fail, which is what we're saying, and ultimately potatoes, I mean, I know they can suffer from it, but it was one of the things that was a get out in terms of being able to save larger populations from starving to death. When you're concentrating on survival, sometimes you're not focusing on metallurgy, and creating iron from.
Obviously, none of these things were planned. It was just a circumstance. Rich people weren't having plates of potatoes. That was a staple. I mean, there's a famous Van Gogh painting of Dutch people eating potatoes. You can Google it. Funny enough, I was discussing not the potato, but I was discussing Van Gogh with my daughter in the car, and it came to mind. And that was their meal. There was no protein in it. They might have had some protein somewhere, and that would be their lunch, dinner, and well, probably not their breakfast, but and that would be their meal every day, every week. They weren't doing it because it was great. They were doing it because that's what they discovered was an easy way of not starving. But I think we've got to be careful. This is not a podcast about the potato.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Although podcast about the potato would be quite interesting. But that's certainly one of the circumstances. And there's probably other maize. I mean, maize, as in sweet corn, as the UK would describe it, but maize is a staple for many countries now. Exported and grown. It's grown in the UK primarily as cattle feed. But it's grown in many countries. That came from the central parts of the American continent. So that's another massive.
Yeah.
And that might have been more obvious because I think that grew reasonably. That grew reasonably wildly as a wild plant. Obviously, it did, and obviously it's been selectively grown to be much better and yields and all this of it now. But that if you were to come across some maize, it looks fairly obvious that it could be eaten. But whether that would have the same impact as the potato is a pretty weird thing. You've got to dig it up, and why would you dig it up if and then it's in the ground. You think, well, can I eat this? Most things in the ground like that are poisonous, but maize is another one. Probably not the same impact because it didn't have an immediate impact in the 19th century. The maize wasn't yes, it was grown in the American continent, but for the indigenous population, well, in our scenario, that indigenous population didn't exist. So, but there are no doubt other.
So if we look back at so North America, South America, Central America. I mean, Central America and South America are very much much more rural today than North America, for example.
Yeah.
Largely. So in North America, if we make it's an environment where it would have started off being more rural, would have probably lasted longer as a more rural environment. The Industrial Revolution obviously has a very large impact on North America. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
If that's delayed, that means that what happens in North America. Before that, I've jumped too far ahead, to be honest. Ultimately, when you think about North America, would there even be the landscape of North America would be completely different. There's no doubt about that.
It's interesting though, because I as you're saying now, I'm starting to wonder, because you could make an argument that, without going back to the potato too much, the potato doesn't exist in Europe. Population doesn't explode. There isn't a labour force. People are poor. People are hungry, but there's still North America. So people would potentially migrate to North America, where there's nobody to there's no issues with the indigenous population. They can expand west. They can grow wheat in the central parts of America.
But there is a question of how would they emigrate? I mean, if
in boats, what do you mean?
No, I know, but they have to. It doesn't get done for free.
Well, exactly, but that's the thing. The drawing
there has to be a reason for moving.
Well, the reason is the same as what actually happened. People are forced off the land because the landowners want to use the land for something else because they can get more money.
But I'm just countering it a little bit. I'm not disputing that would happen. But don't forget, we're talking about a population that would be lower anyway. So the density of people, in Europe would be less than what it was. Yeah.
But again, the same things applied as they did in the 1880s, where people were literally starving in Nordic countries. So they left huge numbers relatively to the population, Sweden and Norway and such like, to North America. So yes, they would still leave. It wouldn't be such huge numbers. But the question,
they still leave. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but then they get to North America, and you've got this workforce. So maybe North America doesn't have a workforce issue. Or let's not worry too much about the slavery issue, because it's a horrendous story. We don't want to go down that. That's for another day. But so let's assume that the history was much the same as it was. But in terms of North America, might zoom away from Western Europe. Western Europe's got a labour shortage issue. Western Europe's losing its labour to North America. I mean, this is sort of the brain drain, if you like, of the 1960s. So North America might pull ahead in the Industrial Revolution, but certainly in the United States of America might pull ahead by virtue of drawing all these Europeans to it, because they will not starve in North America. There's plenty of land. Land is cheap. You're not starving, and then you start looking, well, what do I do with all these people who are not starving, having children, or having children? Well, that's good. The good news is they've got lots of mills for you to work in. It's the current environment today in the 21st century, where people say economies are stagnating because of lack of workforce for whatever reason. If you don't have a workforce, you cannot grow your economy. North America grew its economy in the normal scenario massively. If it was drawing even more proportions of people from Europe because Europe wasn't, and you can't stop people emigrating really.
No.
You know.
But you come to, it still comes down to what they would eat. I mean, fair enough. You'd have a continent that was essentially full of animals that you could eat. There's no doubt about that. So things like the 50 million buffalo herds would still exist. You know, those sorts of things. All right, they probably wouldn't last very long if there's lots of, Europeans turning up because
but they could be farmed. Remember the ultimate purpose of getting rid of the buffalo was deliberate. It was to starve through a genocidal process the Native Americans. Well, there are no Native Americans to genocidally kill off. So controversial for American listeners, but let's have that conversation another day. It wasn't about making fur hats for people. It was killing the buffalo so that the Native Americans had to move away from where they were living into reservations. There was nothing to eat. You starve to death or you move. So if there's no Native Americans, there's no reason to kill the bison, and you can farm them, or manage them, responsibly.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think you're right that North America would have become populated in a similar vein to the way it was. Whether there would be, the history of the USA and Canada would be completely different. I don't believe that would necessarily be the same, because there were other factors which created 13 colonies, and like you say, the expansion west wouldn't have happened, and blah blah blah.
Yeah, I mean, the interaction between the American immigrants and the Native Americans was fairly typical of any scenario like that, but it didn't have again, we can have a chat about it on Twitter, guys, but I don't think it had an intrinsic part as to how modern day America looks. Modern day America would have looked much as it does today, whether there was Native Americans there or not. That's what it wasn't a tragedy or the rest of it, but
I would say that part of North America is based on what happened in Europe. So we still come back to the Industrial Revolution, in that if that's delayed, I mean, don't forget, the Industrial Revolution didn't happen in the US.
Yeah, but the Industrial Revolution, I'm suggesting, isn't delayed technologically. It's delayed in terms of the wealth that the European nations can generate from exploiting it.
I think it would have been delayed, but
what was it about the? There was nothing intrinsically different about the technology being used in North America or Europe. What was the same was that they had huge populations that they could then start working in mills.
But Europe would have been different than it is today. Yeah. So if it
would have been much poorer, not necessarily today, but certainly in the 19th century.
In the 18th century,
it would have been, which would have drawn more people out of Europe to North America, making North America richer, arguably.
But then if you're drawing population out of Europe, then the Industrial Revolution in Europe, what's the driver to have the Industrial Revolution in Europe when it's depopulated?
Well, I agree, but it depends what you mean by the Industrial Revolution. My Industrial Revolution is the global Industrial Revolution, and I think America would have whizzed away. And
well, all I'm saying is if, say, the invention of the steam engine was 50 years later.
Yeah, but I don't think the intellectual aspect is affected. It's kind of hand in glove. So I see where you're coming from. That you've got wealth generates innovation. So if you haven't got the wealth, if you haven't got somebody saying I want more coal at this coal mine, it keeps flooding. You don't need a pump powered by steam to remove it. So I get a bit of that, but some of the major
there has to have been if we're saying that the population would have been less, there's got to have been an impact in Europe. You can't say there wouldn't be an impact.
Well, yeah, but what I think the impact is that instead of producing 1 million ton of steel per week, you produce 500,000 ton of steel. But you're still using the same processes. You just can't do as much because you haven't got enough people to do it. Whereas North America might, or America might have enough people to do it, and they are producing 5 million tons of steel because they've got 3 times as many people to do it. But there's a bit of chicken and egg. I get that. If you haven't,
we can agree to disagree on that one.
Yeah,
but
I think you're presuming that the Industrial Revolution only exists in Europe.
No, I'm not saying that it existed in Europe. I'm saying that it started in Europe.
Yeah, agree.
But if it starts later on, then the impact in the rest of Europe and
But that's the thing.
different.
If the population is much smaller, why does the Industrial Revolution or the possibility of so I invent 5 things and in Europe, I can only exploit 2 of them because I haven't got enough people to exploit. But in North America, I've got potentially enough people to exploit all 5.
I think one of the things that we don't know, or we aren't concentrating on, and fair enough, I don't think this is the time to talk about it, is understanding what the impact of a lower population in the UK, for example, would have done, looking at the basics of where the Industrial Revolution was driven from.
Yeah,
anyway,
no, I get. To some extent, I agree with you. And it's impossible to.
I'm happy for us to carry on with assuming that there isn't going to be that much of an impact.
It's
although,
impossible
I disagree with it. But
it's
that's
impossible
fine.
to put a figure against it. But you're right. I agree that if somebody's not making lots of money, they're less inclined to try and make more money by then saying to some bloke, "And can you just improve this? Can you just improve that? Can you, instead of doing this, can we do that?" So if your economy is stagnant, you don't have that innovation. And a lot of the innovation came from Britain, and if it didn't come from Britain, it wouldn't just naturally come from America. So I agree with you. But there is an alternative that says, well, it could do, but yeah, you're probably right. It would have had an impact on the Industrial Revolution, the global Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
But it might not have done. America might have whizzed away.
But but North America as a continent would look different, in terms of the boundaries and whether there would even be more than one country, that type of thing. I think that other nations would have liked to have had a bigger piece of the pie outside of France and Britain. Who knows? It's
interesting, isn't it? Because if Europe was impoverished, although most of the carving up in North America was done before the real Industrial Revolution started. Well, the massive explosion of Industrial Revolution in the 1830s, 40s. North America was all carved up by then. But it's possible that European states wouldn't have had the ability to influence how things happened in North America. The revolution might have happened earlier, and they might have said, well, you don't want to be controlled by you dying states that are moribund and corrupt and all the rest of it. Although, so there's a million possibilities.
I'm hoping that we've got some listener who sort of going, is keen to provide some feedback and say, you idiots, blah blah blah. What about this, you stupid fools?
Yeah.
Of course, if you have a different North America, there's a lot of things that come out of, there's a lot of things that were driven out of the US, particularly industrialization. Factories, that type of stuff.
Well, certainly in the early 20th century.
Yes.
But,
And that would be different. Maybe later, maybe earlier. Who knows? It certainly would have made a significant difference to.
What we haven't
the world today.
What we haven't considered, and I'll deliberately be.
And I hate to say this, but we're going to be running out of time soon.
Well, all right, but very quickly, provocative. There's no Native Americans. There's slavery. And I think that would have still been there, but there's no Native Americans. This concept that the United States didn't have an empire. Well, ask the Philippines about that. But they didn't need an empire because they colonized North America. So they would have their hands would have been clean in that regard. There wouldn't have been any Native Americans. All right, I'm sure slavery, but
I think you can't get away from the fact that would have happened. It was already happening before. Like I was saying, the Spanish were already using. Slaves 100%. In the Canaries, and only expanded that into the Caribbean.
So slavery's still there, but the genocide against Native Americans would have happened because there wouldn't be any Native Americans there.
That's right. Yeah.
So that aspect, not that that's a massive fracture, rightly or wrongly, in the United States at the moment, but but it's certainly something that is like many countries. Every country has its dirty little secrets. Not that the secrets, but that at least would be something that didn't happen, and that's also true of all the indigenous populations that disappeared in the Caribbean, to a lesser extent in Central America, but certainly in Central America and even in Portugal and Brazil rather, and other parts of Southern America. So that European, and it was the Europeans, obviously, the European genocide against the indigenous populations wouldn't have happened because they weren't there they weren't there in the first place. So that would be an advantage, and from a moral point of view.
Yeah.
But slavery would be whether would slavery have been bigger? I don't think so. It would have still been roughly.
It would have still been there. And just as a last thing, and we've run out of time, and there's probably lots of other stuff that we could talk about.
Let's go back to potato. Let's go back to potato.
Well, one of the things I don't know. If slavery started later or went on longer into North America, for example, would the anti-slavery movement have been later as well, or would it have? It's I don't know. It feels like there
What
would have
do you
been.
mean by the anti-slavery movement? I mean, what do you?
Well, when that first started, certainly in Britain, when I can't remember the time period.
Well, it's the early 1700s with William Wilberforce. It took him the best part of 20 years to stop the slave trade, which isn't the same as stopping slavery.
No.
But
would that have happened if slavery had been bigger in North America? I don't know. I mean, probably, but there might have been.
Well, to be
less.
fair, how much bigger could it be? I mean, the British abolition of the slave trade and slavery, which was 20 years after the slave trade,
yeah, you're right,
was focused around the Caribbean, and every island in the Caribbean was producing its wealth through slavery.
No, that's right. Yeah.
So maybe in North America, perhaps, which is a very much more complicated story for a story for another day. It's no less. That doesn't mean to say that the British Caribbean experience was any better, but the abolition of it was fairly straightforward. People in Britain voted against it. Those were the people who could vote in the first place, which wasn't a very great deal of people in the first place, but ultimately went through Parliament, such as Parliament was in the day.
I suppose the sad thing is that that's the one aspect that wouldn't have changed. So
no. So that's a wide-ranging. I still want to have a podcast about the potato, but
yeah, well, maybe we'll have to do a bit more research on the potato, or maybe get an expert. We need to have.
I've got a friend who's an expert on potato because
he eats a lot.
His background's from Ireland, and he knows everything about potatoes that you need to know. But to be fair to Scotland, we're fairly keen on the potato as well. But no, joking apart, that's been an eye opener.
It went in a slightly different direction than I was expecting, so I found that quite good. So let's hope we've created some consternation or some alternative views that people will be prepared to put something into our Twitter page, which Ian is.
So you could search for Conversations in Time, or you can search for the username ORC_time. Follow us, give us some feedback.
Please give us some feedback.
Yeah, try and keep the Twitter bots off my back. Yeah, we've got lots of followers. If only some of them were real humans, it would be even better. But yes, please give us some feedback.
Okay, thanks for that, Ian. So thanks everybody. Watch out for the next episode. Bye for now.
Bye.
That's it. Now, we want to hear what you think. So those of you who are part of the Twitterati or X-rated or whatever it is these days, you can leave your comments, good or bad, at ORC_time. We love your feedback. Remember, if you liked this podcast, tell your friends. And if you didn't, tell your friends.